That's the discovery of a local author who claimed Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid didn't die.
In 1969, two outlaws created one unforgettable film, and more behind-the-scenes chaos than you'd expect from a Western. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid wasn't just about the wild frontier, it changed the frontier of filmmaking. In this video, we're riding deep into 15 weird facts even die-hard fans might not know. From real bullets to camera bans, grab your hat and saddle up. Let's get started. 1. Paul Newman learned to ride a bicycle. Paul Newman might have looked like he was born in the saddle, but that was a different story regarding bicycles. That iconic scene where Butch Cassidy playfully pedals around to the tune of "Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head." Yeah, Newman had to learn to ride a bike just for that. It sounds like a gag, but it's true. According to multiple interviews and behind-the-scenes retrospectives, Newman hadn't ridden a bicycle in years before filming, and he wasn't exactly thrilled about relearning it under a camera lens. Director George Roy Hill loved the scene idea and pushed for it, even though it wasn't part of the original plan. The scene looks effortless, breezy, charming, and almost improvised, but it took way more effort than it seems. Newman falls a few times trying to master the old-school bike and injures his arm during early takes. A brief talk was about using a stunt double, especially for the trick shots. Still, being the dedicated actor, Newman insisted on doing most of the riding himself, even if it meant limping between takes. Ironically, the bicycle sequence wasn't in William Goldman's original script. It was added later as a tonal shift, a break from the gun-slinging and chase scenes. Hill wanted something light, something strange, something memorable, and somehow it worked. That offbeat moment became one of the most recognizable in film history, giving the movie its quirky, modern flair. So the next time you see Newman pedaling in circles like a carefree teenager, know, those raindrops weren't the only thing falling that day. He earned that moment the hard way. 2. Robert Redford had never ridden a horse before. While Newman mastered two wheels, Redford was learning to ride a horse for the first time. Director Hill insisted on authenticity, so Redford took a crash course and, by filming, rode straight into legend. If Paul Newman was falling off bicycles, Robert Redford wasn't doing much better, just on the other side of the animal kingdom. While Newman was getting bruised, learning to ride a bike for a light-hearted scene, Redford faced something far more central to the film: horses. Seeing him gallop through the open plains like he was born in the saddle is almost unthinkable. But the truth is, when he was cast as the Sundance Kid, Robert Redford had never ridden a horse. Not once. He had to learn fast and do it before a whole crew that assumed he already knew how. There wasn't time for a long prep period or quiet practice on a remote ranch. The clock was ticking, the film was rolling, and Redford had to become a cowboy in real time. It was a crash course in classic Western grit. Determined to get it right, Redford worked with wranglers and stunt experts between takes. He practiced late into the evenings, mounting, dismounting, trying not to look terrified every time the horse moved too fast. What started rough became something he genuinely enjoyed. Years later, he would call horseback riding one of his favorite parts of working on Westerns. It's wild to think the role almost went to someone else because studios weren't convinced Redford could pull off a rugged outlaw. But director George Roy Hill saw past all that. Just like he trusted Newman with a bicycle, he trusted Redford with the reins. And that trust paid off because when the dust cleared, Redford looked the part of a Western legend. 3. The real Sundance Kid was pardoned by the governor. Robert Redford may have had to fake his way into cowboy status, but the real Sundance Kid had no such problem. He was the real deal, quick with a gun, slick on a horse, and a known outlaw. But here's something weird most people don't know. Before becoming an infamous member of the Wild Bunch, the Sundance Kid, whose real name was Harry Alonzo Longabaugh, was pardoned by a state governor on February 4, 1889. Yep, a man who would go on to be part of one of the most legendary criminal duos in the American West once walked away from jail with a clean slate, courtesy of the law itself. Longabaugh's criminal career didn't begin with high-stakes train robberies or Bolivian shootouts. His first arrest was for stealing a horse, saddle, and gun in Sundance, Wyoming, hence the nickname. He was sentenced to 18 months at the Sundance jail, but after serving his time, he received a pardon. That's the part most folks miss. At one point, Sundance wasn't a fugitive. He was a man who had done his time and been officially forgiven by the system. The universe gave him a second chance, and he still chose to ride straight back into legend. Historians debate exactly what turned Longabaugh from a pardoned ranch hand into a full-blown outlaw, but by the time he teamed up with Butch Cassidy, he was all in. Together they became the faces of the Wild Bunch, smooth criminals with style, brains, and enough stolen cash to keep running for years. So while Robert Redford was learning to ride horses for the big screen, the man he portrayed had once walked out of jail with a clean record. And instead of settling down, he rode off into Western infamy with a name that history and Hollywood would never forget. 4. Butch Cassidy was originally going to die in the U.S. The real Sundance Kid walked out of jail with a pardon, but his partner in crime, Butch Cassidy, almost didn't make it past the borders of the United States, at least not in the original story. Before Bolivia, before the legendary final standoff, Butch Cassidy was supposed to die right here on American soil. That iconic freeze-frame ending we all remember, the one that turned two outlaws into timeless myths, it wasn't always part of the plan. When screenwriter William Goldman first set out to tell the story of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, he imagined a very different kind of ending. In early drafts, Butch met his fate in a dusty shootout in the American West. No overseas escape, no running to South America. Just a dramatic but typical Western finale. It was gritty, realistic, and forgettable. But then Goldman started digging into the real lives of the men behind the legend. What he found changed everything. Historical records showed that Butch and Sundance didn't die in the U.S. After years of successful bank and train robberies, they fled to South America to dodge Pinkerton agents breathing down their necks. The true mystery of how they died, in a Bolivian shootout or somewhere else entirely, added a layer of myth that Hollywood couldn't resist. So Goldman rewrote it. The final act blended truth, speculation, and pure cinematic magic. That shift from domestic demise to foreign flight gave the film its edge. It transformed Butch from a local outlaw into a legend with global reach. And it gave the movie its most haunting image. Two men, cornered but unbroken, running headfirst into fate. Had they died in the States like the original plan, the myth might have ended at the county line. But thanks to history and one bold rewrite, it lives on. 5. The studio hated the script's humor. That rewrite that sent Butch and Sundance across the border wasn't the only bold move William Goldman made. The script he turned in didn't just tweak history, it flipped the whole Western formula on its head. And at first the studio wasn't laughing. One of the weirdest facts about Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid is that the very thing that made it iconic, its humor, almost got it shelved. In the 1960s, Westerns were expected to be gritty, straight-faced tales of survival and vengeance. Think John Wayne, not wisecracks. So when Goldman's script included scenes of bank robbers bickering like an old married couple or Butch cracking jokes in the middle of a standoff, studio execs didn't see charm, they saw risk. According to production memos and early reviews, several people at 20th Century Fox felt the tone was too cute for a Western. They were convinced the blend of comedy and action would confuse audiences and flop at the box office. Even George Roy Hill, the director, had to fight to keep certain scenes in. One studio executive reportedly begged him to cut the bicycle sequence with Newman and the Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head soundtrack, calling it pointless and out of place. But Hill, like Goldman, knew that was the point. The oddness gave the film its flavor. It wasn't trying to be a traditional Western. It was trying to be new, modern, funny, tragic, and human. Ironically, the humor they tried to trim gave the film its soul. Audiences didn't just watch Butch and Sundance, they loved them. They laughed with them. And by the time that final freeze frame hit, they missed them. All because one writer dared to joke where others would only shoot. 6. An alternate ending was filmed. The studio may have hated the humor initially, but they had an even bigger problem with the ending. After all the bickering, bank robberies, and Bolivian escapes, the studio still wanted something more concrete. So, believe it or not, there was an alternate ending filmed for Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, one that never made it to theaters. A version where the freeze frame wasn't the last image we saw. Instead of the poetic pause and the sound of bullets firing into eternity, this alternate cut showed exactly what happened next. And it was a lot more graphic. In the scrapped version, the final scene continued after the freeze frame. Viewers would have seen Butch and Sundance riddled with bullets, collapsing in slow motion, blood, dust, and silence. The myth was shattered. It was realistic, sure, but also devastating. Director George Roy Hill, who was always more interested in the legend than the literal, fought to keep the moment symbolic rather than brutal. He didn't want to show their death, he tried to suggest it, and William Goldman backed him. The mystery of what happened to Butch and Sundance in real life gave them the perfect excuse to preserve that ambiguity. Test audiences reportedly responded far better to the freeze-frame ending. They felt the emotional impact more deeply when it left something to the imagination. Executives eventually agreed and the alternate version was locked away. It's rumored to exist in private archives but has never been publicly released. Maybe it never will be. And maybe that's for the best. Because what they chose instead, two friends frozen in motion, outnumbered but defiant, became one of the most unforgettable endings in movie history. It turned two outlaws into legends, not by how they died, but by how they lived and faced the inevitable. 7. Newman and Redford pulled constant pranks. That haunting freeze frame might have closed the film on a note of poetic finality, but things were far from somber behind the scenes. The set of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid was often more comedy club than Western drama. That's because Paul Newman and Robert Redford, while portraying two of the most legendary outlaws in film history, were also two of the biggest pranksters on set. And no one was safe. Their chemistry on screen wasn't just acting. Newman and Redford became fast friends in real life, and their bond was cemented through a series of increasingly elaborate jokes during filming. Crew members have recalled how Newman would rearrange Redford's trailer furniture or fill it with surprises. Redford, not to be outdone, once reportedly rewired Newman's car horn to go off every time he hit the brakes. It was the kind of mischief that kept the long days light and the cast laughing. Director George Roy Hill wasn't immune either. Newman allegedly replaced his typewriter keys with ones that typed the wrong letters to mess with him during script revisions. But Hill, understanding the power of morale on set, let most of the antics slide, as long as they didn't delay the shoot. And remarkably, they never did. If anything, the jokes helped. That on-set playfulness bled right into their performances, the natural banter, the quick comebacks, and the moments of spontaneous humor that made audiences fall in love with Butch and Sundance. It came from an authentic friendship rooted in trust, timing, and a shared sense of mischief. So while the film ends in a hail of bullets, it was built on belly laughs behind the scenes, and that laughter still echoes through every line, every scene, and every perfectly timed smirk those two outlaws delivered. 8. Catherine Ross got banned for touching the camera. While Newman and Redford were busy turning the set into a prank war zone, not everyone was laughing behind the camera. For Catherine Ross, who played Etta Place, the graceful, grounded third wheel in this outlaw trio, one moment of innocent curiosity turned into a whole-blown scandal. In a move that's hard to imagine today, Ross was actually banned from set for touching the camera, not breaking it, not ruining a shot, just touching it. It happened during a quiet afternoon when filming had paused. Ross, who had been dating cinematographer Conrad Hall at the time, wandered over to the camera out of sheer interest. She wasn't messing around or interfering with the shoot. She was curious, watching the crew work and wanting to understand the equipment. So when Hall invited her to try operating it between takes just for fun, she did. What followed was anything but fun. Director George Roy Hill was furious. Whether it was a breach of set protocol or a perceived overstep, Hill had her removed. From that point on, she was only allowed on set when she was needed for a scene. Everyone else could joke, laugh, and even pull pranks on the director. But Ross, one touch of the camera, and she was out. It was a strange and harsh contrast, especially considering how tight-knit the rest of the cast had become. Ross later spoke about the incident in interviews, admitting she was shocked by how seriously it was taken. But despite the setback, her performance remained seamless. She brought quiet strength and warmth to the film, even if she wasn't allowed near the lens again. So while the boys played tricks and dodged bullets, Ross learned the hard way. Some boundaries on set came with a locked door, even if all you did was try to see the story from the other side. 9. The raindrop scene was almost cut. Catherine Ross may have been banned from touching the camera, but her presence in one of the film's most whimsical scenes almost didn't exist at all. That famous moment where Paul Newman pedals a bike in slow circles while B.J. Thomas sings "Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head." It's one of the most iconic sequences in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. But here's the wild part, it was nearly scrapped entirely. The scene was George Roy Hill's idea. He wanted to show Butch Cassidy in a moment of pure joy, something that would humanize him between the robberies and the running. Composer Burt Bacharach and lyricist Hal David were brought in to create a song that would capture that feeling, light, playful, and unexpected. What they delivered was "Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head." Hill loved it. Newman, on the other hand, didn't. He thought it clashed with the tone of the film. Even screenwriter William Goldman wasn't convinced, calling the scene a bit much in early interviews. When the film was screened for test audiences, reactions to the scene were split. Some viewers found it charming and sweet. Others thought it broke the flow of the story. Studio execs debated whether to cut it, and according to multiple accounts, it came incredibly close to being left on the editing room floor. But in the end, it stayed. And somehow that strange little bicycle ride became one of the film's defining moments. The song went on to win an Oscar. The scene gave the movie its heart, and Paul Newman's playful grin circling around Catherine Ross on that borrowed bike etched itself into film history. It's ironic that a moment so out of place ended up being exactly what the film needed. A little rain, a little music, and a reminder that even outlaws deserve a soft spot. 10. The shootout sound effects were real gunshots. The bike scene almost got cut for being too soft, but when it came to the final moments of the film, softness was nowhere to be found. That legendary last stand, the freeze frame just before the hail of bullets, didn't just look intense, it sounded like it. And that's because the gunshots echoing through that Bolivian courtyard weren't studio sound effects or canned Hollywood pops. They were real gunshots, actual firearms, recorded live on set. In an era where most films relied on sound libraries or artificial effects, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid took a different route. George Roy Hill wanted something authentic, something that rattled. So the crew brought in live weapons and captured the echoes of real gunfire in open spaces. It gave the final shootout a distinct audio edge, raw, sharp, and just a little uncomfortable. And that was the point. Sound engineer David Dockendorf, who worked on the film, later explained that the goal was to preserve the realism of the moment. The rest of the film had been stylized, even playful in places, but the final shootout was meant to feel real. Not just look real, sound real. You can hear the difference. The gunfire doesn't feel like it came from a soundboard. It punches through the silence with a jarring finality. It's a subtle detail that most viewers don't notice consciously, but your brain does, and it's part of what makes that last scene so haunting. The sound doesn't let you escape into legend. It anchors you in reality, even as the film cuts to black. So while the music made you smile and the jokes made you laugh, the last thing you hear is a volley of real gunshots. No filter, no fantasy, just the echo of two outlaws choosing to stand their ground. 11. Bolivian extras had to learn marching. The real gunfire may have added weight to the final standoff, but there was something else behind that scene that made it unexpectedly complicated, getting the Bolivian army to show up, not just in numbers, but in coordination. Because when it came time to film that unforgettable ending, the extras hired to play Bolivian soldiers didn't know how to march. Literally, the crew had to stop everything and teach them, step by step. The film's last scene demanded a large group of armed soldiers to converge on Butch and Sundance in perfect unison, creating the visual of overwhelming force. But when production moved to Mexico, where the Bolivia scenes were shot for budget reasons, the filmmakers hired local extras, many of whom were farmers or villagers with no acting experience and certainly no military training. When the director called action, what followed was more parade chaos than battlefield formation. Soldiers shuffled in different directions, out of rhythm, breaking ranks completely. So they paused filming. Production assistants and military advisors brought in by the crew spent hours showing the extras how to march in line, hold their rifles, and move with purpose. It wasn't glamorous, but it was essential. Because without that synchronized march, the tension of the final scene would have collapsed. What's wild is that the very people representing the force that takes down Butch and Sundance had never even worn boots like that before. It was a behind-the-scenes effort that added realism to the moment without anyone ever realizing what went into it. That scene may last only seconds before the freeze frame locks history in place. But getting there took rehearsals, direction, and a crash course in marching, all so the Outlaws' final moment would look as terrifying as it was meant to feel. 12. The studio almost renamed the movie. After training Bolivian extras to march like a real army, you'd think the biggest battles were behind the scenes. But before a single frame was even shot, the studio was already fighting a different kind of war over the title. Believe it or not, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid almost went by a completely different name, and not just once, but several times. Back when William Goldman finished his groundbreaking script, he titled it The Sundance Kid and Butch Cassidy. That was the original order. Goldman liked the rhythm and thought it rolled off the tongue. But when Paul Newman signed on to play Butch, the studio flipped the billing. Star power won the argument and Butch Cassidy moved to the front. Still, even that title wasn't safe. Studio executives grew nervous that a name like that wouldn't draw big audiences, especially those who didn't recognize the outlaws. Westerns were in decline, and the studio wanted to cover its bases. At one point, alternative titles like The Outlaws or Sundance and Butch were tossed around. Another suggestion was Two Guys from Wyoming, which thankfully never made it past the discussion table. Marketing departments argued back and forth, unsure whether the current title would connect with younger viewers or seem like just another cowboy flick. George Roy Hill and Goldman stood their ground. They knew the names were the soul of the story. They weren't just outlaws, they were legends. Eventually, the original title, with the now reverse name order, stuck, and history proved them right. The name didn't just work, it became iconic. You can't say Butch Cassidy without thinking Sundance Kid, and you can't imagine the film with any other name, even if the studio almost buried the legend before it began. 13. George Roy Hill clashed over tone. After surviving studio debates about the title, George Roy Hill still had another storm to weather, one that struck at the heart of the film's identity. The tone, the very spirit of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, was something the studio didn't fully trust. It wasn't just that the humor felt too modern or the action too slick. It was that Hill wanted to tell a Western that didn't feel like a Western at all. And the studio fought him nearly every step of the way. Hill envisioned something fresh, a film that honored the mythology of the Wild West, but let its characters feel human, vulnerable, even funny. He leaned into William Goldman's witty dialogue, allowed for moments of silence and absurdity, and introduced a visual rhythm that broke tradition. There were freeze frames, slow-motion sequences, and that now famous bicycle scene set to a pop song. It wasn't just different, it was risky. The executives at 20th Century Fox didn't see the vision. They argued it was too clever, too ironic, and not action-packed enough. They wanted a grittier, more straightforward shoot-'em-up. But Hill refused. He fought to keep the tone balanced, lighthearted but tragic, funny but melancholic. He believed the charm and emotional weight of Butch and Sundance came from the contrast between their larger-than-life exploits and their very human connection. Eventually, Hill got his way. Not because the studio agreed, but because test audiences responded powerfully to the film as it was. The laughter, the heartbreak, the hesitation before the final charge, it all worked. And Hill proved that tone, when handled with care, could be more powerful than gunfire. So while the studio may have wanted cowboys, Hill gave them characters. And in doing so, he helped redefine what a Western could be. 14. Redford didn't like the role at first. George Roy Hill might have fought to protect the film's tone, but he wasn't the only one with doubts during production. Even Robert Redford, whose name would eventually become inseparable from the Sundance Kid, didn't warm up to the role right away. In fact, he nearly turned it down altogether. At the time, Redford was still carving out his identity in Hollywood, and he wasn't sure this clever, brooding outlaw was the right fit for him. The studio originally wanted a bigger star opposite Paul Newman, someone like Steve McQueen or Warren Beatty, but Hill saw something in Redford that others didn't. He lobbied hard to cast him, believing his quiet intensity would ground the film. Redford, though flattered, didn't immediately see himself in the part. He didn't think he was Western enough, and more than that, he wasn't sure he could hold his own next to Newman, who was already a giant in the industry. It took a personal call from Hill and a few long conversations to convince him. Redford later admitted that he only truly understood the character after diving deep into the script. He realized Sundance wasn't just a gunslinger, he was a man of few words, driven by loyalty and a need for control in a world crumbling around him. That quiet complexity appealed to Redford, and from that moment on, he was in. The irony is that today, the Sundance name is so tightly woven into Redford's identity that it has become the title of his independent film institute and festival. But it all started with doubt, a hesitation to saddle up, and a director who saw something the actor didn't yet. 15. Goof and final scene. Redford might have hesitated before stepping into the role of Sundance, but once he did, the chemistry was lightning in a bottle. That dynamic carried all the way through to the very last scene, one that became etched into cinematic legend. But here's something few fans realize. A goof made it into that iconic ending, and not only was it left in, it was left in on purpose. In the final scene, Butch and Sundance are pinned down in a Bolivian courtyard, wounded, running low on ammo, and completely surrounded. They make a decision, go out shooting. With guns drawn, they charge forward together. But in the moment before the freeze frame, if you watch closely, there's a slip. Redford's character is holding his gun in the wrong hand. For a marksman like Sundance, that's a huge mistake. He'd spent the entire film shooting right-handed. Suddenly, in the climax of the movie, he's holding his weapon in his left hand. The error wasn't lost on the filmmakers. During post-production, editors flagged it, but George Roy Hill made the call to leave it untouched. Why? Because the emotion of the moment was too perfect. The performance, the lighting, the framing, it all clicked. Reshooting it would have meant tampering with lightning. So the mistake stayed. In a film that's so carefully crafted, the choice to keep that little inconsistency speaks volumes. It shows that sometimes the magic of storytelling is bigger than technical precision. The emotion of the scene eclipsed the details, and in doing so, it preserved one of the most powerful endings in cinema history. So the final freeze may be legendary, but it isn't flawless. And maybe that's exactly why it works. Two imperfect men charging into history, guns blazing and hearts aligned, even if one of them forgot which hand to use. And there you have it, 15 wild facts about Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. From real gunfire to nearly losing the title and cutting that iconic bike scene, this film was as daring behind the scenes as it was on screen. It didn't just entertain, it redefined what a Western could be. Which of these behind-the-scenes moments surprised you most? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this, give the video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and share it with a fellow film lover. Now go ahead, click on the next video on your screen. You won't want to miss it.